Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our discussion related to who is responsible for slavery. The discussion related to the tornadoes sparked a number of questions and concerns about the ideas of justice and having justice being served and this idea of reparations. We have discussed extensively the dynamic of reparations, what would bring about reparations, how one could look to pursue reparations, how you construct the argument for reparations, and most importantly, standing with respect to reparations. Yes, legal standing. One of the things that is missed in the discussion of reparations, in the discussion of slavery, in the discussion of justice, is the complicated nature of the slave trade. We are talking about a slave trade that involved multiple continents, multiple groups of people, religious dynamics, secular dynamics, some individuals serving as enslavers, and then in some instances, perhaps their descendants were enslaved. You have all sorts of dynamics related to phenotype that are going on. It makes it very difficult to understand exactly who is responsible for what. Let's take the Caribbean, for example. Individuals in the Caribbean have pursued reparations. Let me tell you what makes reparations complicated in the Caribbean. The Caribbean was filled with people that you would consider of color, brown people, black people, in the Caribbean. And there was a dearth of what would be considered light people or white people in most of these Caribbean nations, these Caribbean islands. However, there is the assertion that there was significant slavery in the Caribbean. And so what you have is a history of dark people enslaving dark people being the overseers in terms of slavery in the Caribbean. Now, some of these darker people came from Africa, overseeing this entire dynamic. Many of the darker people, however, in the Caribbean came straight out of Europe. And so it makes it very, very difficult to ascertain the extent to which an individual in the Caribbean is culpable for slavery or was a victim of it. You have the same dynamic going on in mainland America. People focus on skin color versus focusing on lineage. People focus on phenotype versus focusing on actual culpability. And so when you don't know what your lineage is, there may be a temptation to assume that all brown people were enslaved and all lighter people were enslavers, that all brown people were victimized and all lighter people were the victimizers. And what happens when you do this is you actually muddy any justice claim. And we've talked about this before. The idea of justice, the idea of equity, the idea of remedies, those ideas need to be tied to actual harm, actual standing, and actual culpability. Not culpability in the air, not theoretical culpability, but real culpability. We can look at Africa also. There are often assumptions that Africa is victimized. When we are talking about slavery, however, Africa is quite culpable. The Arab world, quite culpable. There is some intense need to focus on the current state of Europe when talking about slavery. However, the overwhelming majority of people involved in the slave trade are not in Europe right now. those individuals are spread out all over the place. And this is something that you need to keep in mind when thinking about this idea of justice, this idea of repair. You might also want to go back and revisit our discussions about what happened with the Kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa and what happened with those other kingdoms that remain there today. So many of the people continue being there today, but that kingdom somehow disappeared. That kingdom was enslaved. Somebody had to be the enslavers. What happens, however, is this dynamic of pointing the finger in another direction. The enslavers are still there. Many of the enslavers are people who are in Africa, who were in Africa. Many of the enslavers, however, came from the Arab states. Many of the enslavers came from Europe and then transplanted themselves on the west coast of Africa. Because in terms of phenotype, they don't really look different. The Europeans looked like the Africans. The people from the Arab states looked like the Africans. And so therefore, they were able to pretend to be Africans and do things in the names of the people who were indigenous to that place. You had the same thing happening in the United States. And so when you have the people who are doing things they have no business doing, looking like the indigenous people of the land, you have a possibility of having things obscured in terms of who is responsible. When you have the ethnic cleansing that took place in Europe, where they wiped out large numbers of people and deported them that had a dark phenotype, again, it becomes very difficult to figure out who's responsible for what. And so we're just going to quickly look at an example of what makes it difficult to ascertain culpability. We've looked at this with Benin and Dahomey. We've talked about it with respect to other nations in Africa. We are going to look at another example that you need to consider when thinking about these justice claims. You cannot get justice by the halves. You need to seek justice by the whole. Now, of course, there are multiple accounts of the slave trade on the west coast of Africa, and we've reviewed a number of them. This is another resource to consider, and this is a new account of Guinea and the slave trade. Now, this addresses what took place on the west coast of Africa with respect to the conquest of the kingdom of Ouida, the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Juida, with respect to the king of Dahomey. Now, there are some conflicting narratives about what took place, but much of what is in this particular narrative is consistent with the history that is offered by Benin. Also, some of the history that's coming out of Scotland related to what took place. Now, it's important to remember that these people on the west coast of Africa, many of them were deported. They were kicked out of Europe for various reasons. And then you had takeovers in Europe. But you still had this relationship going on between Africa and Europe. They were the same people. The same thing applies to America. Many of the people that remained in Europe were related to the people who came to the Americas. And this, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about light people or dark people. We are talking about relations, and blood is thicker than water. And so you have some people who are light serving one role. You have those same family members that are dark serving another role, while they are pretending not to even know each other. And so that creates more complications in terms of understanding exactly what took place. It also creates complications in terms of culpability. And so you have some instances where individuals are taking on a victim role, when if you look back through their ancestry, and they probably have looked back through their ancestry. If you look back through their ancestry, you will see that their ancestors were not the victims that you believe their ancestors were. In many instances, You have individuals who were coming out of Europe, coming out of Africa, and they were able to set up shop in the Americas and take on another identity and then absolve themselves and any of their ancestors of any wrongdoing or play two sides against the middle. And so it becomes very complicated to get clarity about this issue of culpability. If you've done your ancestry, you will probably find that it's complicated, that it's not as clear cut as people would like to believe. It's not as obscured as some people thought their ancestries might be. And so they may not find all of these missing ancestors. They may find found ancestors and ancestors with histories that are tied to the Americas in terms of being indigenous. But also, what many people should be finding is these ancestors that are tied to Europe. And they are not as obscured because they were keeping better records of their heritage. And so you will tend to find more information about them. You will tend to find them being landowners. You will tend to find them being multi-ethnic, meaning they were identifying based upon a multiplicity of ethnicities. That is, if people are being honest about what they are finding. You have some individuals, however, who have an investment in pretending that their ancestors were something that they were not. Or sometimes people are just confused because they have not found the information that they have been seeking about their ancestors, and so therefore they will make assumptions about who their ancestors happen to be. And then you muddy all of that with the issue of the descendants of Noah, and it becomes very, very complicated. It also becomes complicated because in many instances, those who were victimized were mixed in with those who were the victimizers. And the victimizers are the ones who are creating the history. Their narrative is the narrative that gets told. And this is the case whether you are talking about Europe or America, or you are talking about that west coast of Africa, or you are talking about those Arab states. Those are the histories that get reported, not the histories from the mouths of the individuals who were actually enslaved. This text also talks about how individuals were enslaved in Africa and how they were transported from Guinea to the Americas. While this text is from the 1700s, it comports significantly with offerings that are more recent coming out of the various countries on the west coast of Africa in terms of what took place with the slave trade. One of the things mentioned by this reporter is that it was a custom among the kingdoms on the west coast of Africa to enslave individuals who were taken captive in war. And so the standard was to enslave the individuals who were captured and either destroy them or sell them. If the numbers were too great to manage, then they destroyed the individuals. And this destruction took place in a number of ways. In some instances, they were sacrificed in these religious sacrifices. And then in some instances, they were simply destroyed. And one of the concerns was that the individuals, if they were not sold into slavery and they weren't taken out of the area, that they might rebel and then endanger the safety of the individuals who took them captive. And so this was the resolution. Now, historically, there has been quite a focus on Dahome's role in the transatlantic slave trade with respect to the Kingdom of Ouida. However, you have other groups that were involved in the enslaving process. And so we've talked about some of those other groups. And here you have another example. In this particular example, the writer is talking about what is identified as a Negro child being tied to a stake that was driven in the ground, and that the child was being set aside to serve as a sacrifice for prosperity for a god known as Ebo, EGBO. This individual made some moves in order to secure the safety of the child, and there was an aggressive response to that. And so here you have yet another group involved in this enslaving and destruction process. These groups are often ignored because there is a focus on the Americas. There is a focus on the destination. There is a focus on skin color. There is a focus on phenotype. There's an obsession with it. And because of that obsession, it obscures truth. It obscures the total reality of what was going on. And so you can see here that there are other individuals involved in this entire dynamic. And with respect to this particular group, you can also see that there might be a relationship between this group and Europe. We already know that there's a relationship between Igbo, IGBO, and Europe, and also Asia. But you also see other manifestations of these connections. You can see the crown that is being worn. It is very European in its appearance. And there were significant European connections between Africa and Europe, just as there were between the Americas and Europe. And so there is no dearth of culpability. What there is a dearth of complete analysis of this entire dynamic, and a dearth of analysis of ancestry in order to figure out the extent to which one fits in one category in terms of lineage, or one fits in another category in terms of lineage. And when you have a dynamic where the enslavers look similar to those who are enslaved, it muddies the water significantly. And these are just additional examples of the situation where it's very, very complicated, because in this instance you have individuals who were definitely enslavers. However, it's also very easy for these individuals and the descendants of these individuals to identify as enslaved when your entire slavery paradigm is based upon phenotype. This is why it is so difficult to disentangle all of this in places such as Jamaica. Jamaica is replete with Europeans who look exactly like the individuals who were enslaved in terms of phenotype, in terms of having brown skin, in terms of having curly or coily hair, and in some instances having straight hair. And so it makes it very difficult to tease this entire thing out. And so when people start talking about retribution and restitution, you have to first identify that you have standing. And then you have to identify very clearly the entity from which you are seeking this restitution. And you need to incorporate everyone, because that is the way that justice works. And so if everyone is not incorporated, it makes it very difficult to make the claim related to restorative justice. And it makes it very difficult to actually have some sort of resolution. And what again is muddying this entire dynamic is this descendants of Noah issue that keeps popping up. And then you have individuals who claim other people. You have the 12 tribes chart with all of these places, and then claiming all of these people are the descendants of Jacob. There is no proof right now that I have seen to show that the Bahamas had this particular son of Jacob. Jamaica had this particular son of Jacob. Brazil had this particular son of Jacob. The evidence for this does not appear apparent. The evidence for this has not been brought forth. And so what you have in some instances are individuals who are making all of these claims for justice, when in fact they may have been the descendants of the people bringing the injustice. You have a number of situations where indigenous people are involved and indigenous rights are involved, and taking on the identities of indigenous people and muddying that situation. And so this situation becomes more and more complicated as more supposed facts present themselves. And so when individuals are taking on that victim identity without making sure that they actually are the victims, it becomes a problem. And there is a suspicion that this is an overwhelming dynamic going on. What is likely going on is those individuals who actually are the descendants of individuals who were enslaved, those are probably the most unvoiced people in this entire situation. And individuals who are very voiced, very knowledgeable, have all of this information, all of this insight, those individuals, more likely than not, are descended from individuals who may not have suffered to the same extent as the individuals who have been unvoiced. But simply because of a person's skin color, a person may be given a platform and a voice to speak for other people that they don't even really speak for. And there is a great suspicion that that is what is taking place. That is what has taken place historically. Those who had mouthpieces also had resources. Those who did not have mouthpieces were busy serving as the resource for the resourced people, regardless of the skin color or the phenotype of the resourced people. Hopefully that made sense. And so when individuals are talking about this idea of justice and this idea of justice claims, one of the things that they need to keep in mind is that it is very difficult to disentangle when you have a phenotype-based paradigm of everything. It is very difficult to disentangle who is the victim and who is the victimizer, who is the enslaver, who is the enslaved. And simply going by phenotype and stories that are passed down, that is insufficient. Both of those dynamics are insufficient. What matters is ancestry, an ancestry that is actually tied to a dynamic, ancestry that is definitively tied to being enslaved, or ancestry that is definitively tied to being an enslaver. When you have a dynamic such as this situation, and you have a dynamic such as the Benin situation, and you have a dynamic of people being deported out of Europe based upon phenotype in many instances, and phenotype being related to ancestry, and then some of those individuals being able to take on the role of oppressor. They may have been oppressors in Europe in the first place. You have individuals who were ejected out of the Iberian area. You have people who were ejected out of India and other parts of Asia and inserted into the Americas. And so you have a number of narratives that are going on here. And it's not always clear about who is who and what who was doing when. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.